Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Gen Con Panel to Play live event for Atomic Mass Games. For those of you who don't know, we are the creators behind Marvel Crisis Protocol, and we're here today to discuss how we develop and design characters from the comic page and bring them into the game itself. So joining me, I'm going to have our senior lead developer, Will Pagani. So let's bring him in, Josh.
Hello.
Hello, sir.
How's it
Glad to
going?
see that. Oh, I'm doing great. I'm glad to see that you are not a robotic aperture with like a little camera on it, because I think people thought I was going to talk to a camera the whole time based on how Josh had that shot set up.
Well, you are talking to a camera, just
I
not
am
that.
talking to a camera and a computer screen, and I got a Josh behind like bulletproof glass because of social distancing, so I don't have to wear a mask. This has been my favorite Gen Con, just based on everything that's gone through. Like same amount of excitement, work, everything else, but I'm basically like in a Pope bubble the whole time.
That
So
seems great, honestly. I always get sick of Gen Con, so I'm excited. That's probably not going to happen this time.
it's true. This will be the
Hopefully,
one
fingers crossed.
time with no like con crud. It's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
All right, so let's dive in because we've only got an hour. We got a lot of ground to cover in terms of just talking about our design philosophy, how we make these awesome characters, how we try to do Marvel justice. So first, just tell us a little bit about yourself, Pagani.
Well, I am a developer, so what that means is I don't normally design rules for the game. I usually develop them. So I will take concepts given to me by Shick, our developer, our designer, and I will iterate on them and create the game content around them and do that kind of thing. So usually, not always, but usually I don't come up with any unique concepts. And then I guess you asked me to talk about me, not what development is.
Well, I
So,
mean, like what you do here and
sure.
anything you feel
Sure.
relevant to our conversation that's coming.
Yeah. So I do a lot of development, and then I do some design work for some characters. Like I got to design Thanos, and that was really exciting.
Hmm.
So I was really hyped about that one. And then of course the Ultimate Encounters and stuff is a lot of the stuff that I do specifically here at Atomic Mass Games. Um, I also run all the playtest stuff and that kind of thing. So
Yeah, so on the flip side, I'm the head of studio of Atomic Mass Games. I'm also the primary designer for most of the stuff that comes out for the game itself. What that largely means, like Pagani kind of touched on, is that I'll come up with generalized concepts and character direction and all this stuff. I'll name a lot of the things and say, okay, we want this character to function this way. And then I'll hand that over to Pagani. We'll have a fun meeting where he's like, are you crazy? There's no way we can do this. This won't work. And then he takes those generalized concepts and he turns them into rules language that fit all of the parameters and everything else that he's set up. So it's a fun yin and yang that we get to do where I'm kind of the dreamer and he's more of the realist. And every once in a while we flip. Like, for example, you mentioned Thanos. One of the things that I think when we were talking about that, just to kind of go into how the concepting phase does, because this dovetails in really well, is we'll pick characters. So we decide our schedule, and our schedule is pretty far forward looking because we need a lot of time to be able to play test to make sure everything's going. And we also have to go through Marvel for that, and they have suggestions and stuff that go back and forth. So we set up basically our target for what we're going to be doing for 18 months ahead, and then we began working on concepts briefs, talking about design briefs and all this stuff. But one of the things that happens is that we'll look at that character list, and every once in a while we'll be like, well, we know Thanos was going to be the introduction of the Ultimate Encounter. So it was going to be a larger kind of scope where it was going to be this big boss that was going to take on all these little characters. And Pagani was like, well, I really love playing the big monsters in a lot of different game expressions. And so because he had so much experience with that and he had a lot of ideas, I was like, why don't you take that? Because it's kind of like in your wheelhouse. So a lot of design just comes from, drawing from ingredients. And we use the cooking analogies a lot when we do the hobby streams and stuff. But it's true of any creative enterprise. Like what you're doing is not creating salt. you're taking salt and you're taking paprika and you're taking brown sugar and you're taking ribs and you're making them into something that's delicious.
I was about to say, this sounds like a rib rub we're making here.
I know, is right? The brown sugar gave it away.
Every time.
So that is really important in the overall scope of things. Like having a broad depth or a good understanding of the different ingredients that you want to bring together makes a huge impact on what you're going to be able to cook or come out with when it comes to the game. Magneto was another one that Pagani was really interested in because he was another high threat level character that was going to be kind of godlike in a big boss experience. So those ones I often defer to him. And then there are times in the studio where designing will actually happen concurrently with Josh or Dallas if somebody has an extreme love of that character. Daredevil is a good example where Josh and I worked together on the design brief because Daredevil is Josh's like number one love in Marvel Comics. And while I liked Daredevil, I knew that having somebody who truly loves the character and knows the character in ways that I don't is going to open up different avenues, and even in discussion it's going to improve that. So that's kind of like the overarching what we're looking for when we're doing concepting. The other big things that we're working on, because we want to talk about how we take this character from the page to a final miniature and playable character in the game, is that we develop a concept brief that is what they look like. Josh and Dallas talked about this in their art panel yesterday, but we're looking at what era of the character we're taking. Oftentimes we'll take multiple different looks from different comic runs or creative teams, and we'll mix them together because we also have to keep an eye on how is that going to impact engineering? How is this miniature going to go together for the end user? And there are certain things, as we've learned and developed our process, that we can do to make sure that the assembly experience is really smooth and easy. There's less hobbying work that needs to happen on these characters. We're going to get more dynamic poses, all of this stuff. So it's a big conglomeration of taking all these things. And every once in a while, the best part of the job for me is that I get to go back and read an entire comic run to try to prep myself to be able to dive into design, because you always want to have it fresh in your mind and you're going to come up with these great ideas. And so for a day I get to spend work just reading Marvel Unlimited and going through all these runs or rereading runs that I loved to remember like how these things are going.
Like I remember when we were first starting on X-Men stuff, right? I had never really read an X-Men comic. Like I'm sure I had at some point, but like I hadn't really been into it. So I ended up buying several of these different comic runs, and like Mutant Genesis was like an awesome one that I got to read, and I was really excited about that one when we were originally doing the concepting for X-Men, because I wasn't super familiar with those characters. So becoming more familiar with them was honestly great and really exciting. And we got to then sort of pull in parts from those different comics into each of these characters. So there's a lot of research, I guess, that goes on in the background at the forefront, right?
Yeah, the source material is obviously really important, right? Because our goal, as we talked about in our panel yesterday, is that we're creating a method, an experience that allows players to play out their own Marvel comic story, right? So having the characters be reflective of what people believe or think about in those characters, having them function on the tabletop in a manner that feels correct for them, is all going to add to that narrative and make the game feel like like it really came off the page. In Marvel Comics. So there's a big internal review point where we all sit together and we all talk about, okay, well, this is the design, this is where we're going with it. This is before Pagani has really turned it into rules.
It's sort of like the last step before it comes
in. It is.
Yeah,
it's the last hurdle before Pagani starts to really do the work. And so it's things like, does this ability reflect what we want? Are we missing something? And a lot of the times there's give and take, because there's only so much room on a card. And, like we've talked about, you can't do everything for a character that somebody might think of. So you have to distill down into what's the core of the character. And there are certain things that will change or that will flip over or get rid of in order to make room for something else that feels more impactful. But once that internal review is done, the character design work is basically complete. So that character concept that has all of the different artistic picks, it has a character pose, all of that stuff goes to Marvel for approval. They review it, make sure that they're happy with our direction on it, that it's reflecting the character properly. We also, at the design phase, typically talk about what kind of art we want with the characters for their cards. So in generalized views, like what are some of the team tactic cards we want to see? Who are some of the characters that we want to emphasize in those cards? We don't really know what those cards do yet, but having just a generalized understanding of what's going to happen helps us actually make the art briefs, which then go to Josh and Dallas, and we work through those. So that's the big process. And then once we're done with that design phase, which is hopefully sketched out the character to a point that if you can play without exact rules, you could actually function in the game with them, it goes to Pagani. And then Pagani does the real work of taking that rough shape and sculpting it into an actual rules packet. So why don't you talk about that, Pagani?
Yeah, so there's a lot of the times when I receive these design documents from Shick, it'll be like Iron Man reduces damage by 1, right? And like I'm let you use Iron Man, right? Because I remember doing this back at the very, very, very beginning. Iron Man, repulsor blast, and it had range numbers on it, so it was like range 4, strength 4, cost 0, right? Like gains power for damage. So it has like essentially non-precise wording for all of these rules, and sometimes it gets a little more vaguey than others.
Sometimes it's just like we'll talk about this as we go forward, but for example, transform.
Yes.
For Ant-Man and Wasp, it was we're going to replace one character with a smaller version of the character, and they're going to be miniatures.
Yep.
So
figure it out.
Like you write it so it works, but that's what needs to happen.
Yeah, and that's sort of my job, right? Is taking the creative and exciting concepts and then making sure that they fit into the timing chart, making sure that they fit into the turn structure and stuff. And sometimes that's really easy, right? And sometimes that's really not easy. And that's like the part of the discussions where Shick is like, or where I'm like, Shick, you're crazy, we can't do this. And then it usually turns out that we can, and we figure out how to do it. But it's always very interesting, I guess, whenever I get a concept from Shick and I'm like, oh God.
And there certainly have been things where we've walked away from them, right?
For sure.
One of the big things I don't think that we have to be too shy about saying, because we've come to this conclusion like 3 or 4 times over the course of Crisis Protocol development, is taking control of another character that you don't own probably will never happen, because we've tried it how many times and it's always opened up a bigger can of worms than is worth it. And every time the conversation comes up, Pagani's like, I think I can do it this time. And you go for like a month and you're just like, no, it doesn't really work.
Well, like it functions. It's just not fun or exciting, or like it doesn't feel good for players. We talked a lot yesterday in our development panel about like the concepts of the game, the things that we want to do with the game. And one of the big things that we talked about was like, we want players to have fun. We want it to be an enjoyable experience. We want it to keep moving and not be confusing. And definitely that doesn't check any of those check boxes, right? Because when you take someone's character, someone's going to feel bad. And yeah, I don't need to go into the specifics. If you've played mind control cards or effects in other games, you know what's up. It never, both people are never smiling at the end of it, basically.
Right. And that is a big kind of core concept when we're looking at the characters, right? I think, from design to development, one of the things that we're also doing is, as you're crafting the rules, we're looking at the balance of what does a character offer? Almost depending on the character, but I would say almost every time we want to make sure that there's a good number of reactive powers as well as active powers. How does that character spend power effectively? Does it keep the player engaged? Because one of the big things, like we talked about yesterday, is that constant interaction between players. That's one of the big pillars behind the experience of Marvel Crisis Protocol. There's no time to stare at a TV screen while your opponent does this thing and then come back and be like, okay, well, what happened to me? Yeah. We want the players to be constantly engaged with the action, making decisions. Even if you're not actively doing anything, the fact is you have those choices, and then you have to think about how those choices will domino down to your turn. Does Cap want to spend 4 power to bodyguard and vibranium shield and not maybe have enough to shield slam when he activates?
Certainly. It's Yeah, I think it's very important for every character to have something to do at all times in the game, and that doesn't necessarily mean that like they need to do everything every turn, right?
Mhm.
But that's a big part of development as well, is making sure that the characters are engaging, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So
and so the way that we approach that is once you've crafted the rules, we will then go through basically internal testing.
yeah,
And that's where we as a studio come together, we play a lot of games, we see what's working, we see what is missing from rules text, if anything's completely unintelligible
sure.
or something's just broken, we'll fix that. That's pretty rare. Most of the times what will happen is we'll just quickly realize that the way we thought something works doesn't quite work that way.
Yeah,
And then we'll make small
or
adjustments.
something, right? Like
Yeah.
that's the big one that gets caught in that phase is like a rule just it says do something, but it doesn't say when to do that thing
Hmm.
or something. So it's like, how does this work? So that's sort of like our first proofread, I guess,
Yep.
of the rules, right? Is the internal testing, and we
Yeah.
play, gosh, I don't know, a month of play testing or something at that stage, maybe more.
Typically, depending on the character and how new they are, like Thanos was obviously a huge amount of internal testing
That was
before
six
we
months.
ever sent him out.
Yeah,
Or the arrival of the X-Men and mutants coming into the game. That was another one that was very heavy on internal testing because we wanted to make sure that these characters were really focused on and we're going to represent these super popular iconic characters well in the game. So there are times where that happens, and then there are times where it's like nothing's really breaking a mold. It's just a new, it's just a new character, and so we make sure that everything feels right, and that can go a lot quicker.
yeah, that's true. When we do introduce either some really crazy superpowers that do very different things, and I think some examples of that would be like Green Goblin's Trick or Treat, right? It's
Hmm.
sort of like a new style. It's not a throw, but it's kind of a throw. So like it's a new style of something like
Hmm.
that, or like Infinity Gems, just in general, right?
Yep.
They had all sorts of different interactions with different characters, and I remember originally we were like anybody can take them. And they were like, no, don't do that. like limited to specific characters, and then we can actually play test them all, and we don't have to worry about it designing forward, right? I remember that
Yep.
was a big discussion that happened. But when there are mechanics like that on characters and stuff, they definitely get a lot more attention in internal testing, I guess.
Hmm.
Um, and you can kind of shortcut past some of the stuff when it's I'm going to say like standard characters, but that's not to say that they're not exciting. It's just they don't break the rules in a new way or anything.
Right. Well, and another goal of your development pass too is to take those designs and then find where you can standardize the rule expression, not necessarily the name. It's not like, this character that we want to be able to, like if somebody with a rope, I can't say any names because then people will be like, oh, he's coming or she's coming. And then they'll find out that this character doesn't have a rope and they'll be like, well, that was a lie. So imagine a character in the comics could rope somebody and pull them in, kind of like Spider-Man. But
Yeah,
then we gave that person the webline ability just wholesale because we wanted everything to be standardized. You'd be like, that's really weird. They don't shoot webs. So that's where
yeah,
we talked about the rules themselves might be standardized, the effect of the ability, but the title of the ability will be different so that
mhm,
it influences the flavor of the character.
for sure, for sure. So after that process is kind of done, we then move on into external stuff. We have a big group of external testers. I'm not going to say how many because I'm not sure that I can, but it's a lot. And they do a great job out there.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, once we're done with internal, it then goes to external. We post up all the new playtest rules for all of them, and then everyone loses their mind. And they're like, you guys are crazy. We can't do any of this. I'm like, I've already been through this once, but let's do it again. So we kind of have like our initial phase, which is sort of like the hot takes phase, or
The
like
hot takes phase is the best phase
it is.
because
Nobody
it,
understands anything. What do these things even do?
oh,
Like it's really fun to see that one, right? Because that's kind of like our first taste of like what are players going to think about
mm-hmm,
when they see these rules, right? And we have play testers that are all the way from like the super competitive people that want to
mm-hmm,
play tournaments nonstop and never want to do anything to the I love Spider-Man because of this XYZ comic run, and I don't even really care if he's good. It's just like, does he feel like Spider-Man and is he great? And then we take
mm-hmm.
all the feedback from between those two poles and we squish it together and we make sure that we hit all the flavor from the flavor testers and all the power level and exciting and balanced stuff from the tournament testers. And the hot take step is always hilarious to me because of that, right? It's like we have two hugely different groups of playtesters that are smashing their opinions together into these things that are like, I think this rule should be named this because of this comic run, and then the competitive guy's like, who even cares about that? Like, so I don't know. It's just hilarious to me that you get these super different opinions.
I mean, how many iterations of Punisher's basic attack did we have to go through before everyone was happy that that name, not the effect, just the name felt right for the Punisher.
But we ended up back at the first effect with a different name, and I think it got named 4 or 5 different things.
Yeah, and there are times where we do make choices based on that flavor feedback, where I'll come in and you'll be like, the playtesters want to do this, and I'll be like, why? That's worse. Like, it's a downgrade in power level, not a huge one, but like just enough where I'm like, they realize that's worse, right? And he's like, yeah, but it doesn't. I mean, it feels more like the character to them. So we'll make those concessions because again, the importance is not making everything the best in terms of power. It's making sure everything is thematic and flavorful and tells the narrative that we want to tell.
Yeah. Because we're not here making fishing weights, right? Like we're here making characters, and these characters are the most important thing in the game. And if they don't feel like the characters, we have failed as developers and designers. So also, if they're not balanced and fun to play with and against, I feel like we've also failed a little bit. So there's certainly 2 sides to this coin.
It all comes down to experience, right? Like I am less concerned about somebody who is fully focused on that competitive mindset of the rules balance and finding the best, just the best, the top 1%. I'm less concerned about that person than I am about the person who's like, I love Daredevil, Ghost Rider, and Punisher, and I want them on my team. As long as that person, which I think is the larger segment of the population,
certainly
finds joy in that character, then we know that our extensive testing and the way that we look at these things to make sure that the rules are fair and balanced as best they can, with all the variables and everything, will sort itself out for that much smaller percentage.
There are a lot of variables.
A lot of variables. And not everything is supposed to be as good as everything else. Like, that's not how any game that has, as you said, characters works.
Yeah. And I know a lot of people, like, what am I trying to say here? A lot of people aren't as concerned with balance as they are about enjoying the game and having fun. But I think a better balanced game will let people also have more fun. So
100%, right? Like,
it's super important for that casual side and the competitive side to have a balanced game.
Yeah, I think that's the reason we play games, right? Like, we want to go and we want to walk away enjoying. Now, the things that tick the enjoyment boxes will be different. And that's obviously the challenge of your job and partly like my job and then the whole studio and the playtest and everything is like, it's finding the balance. You're never going to be 100% for somebody because if you are, you're 0% for everyone else.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do you keep that scale as even as possible?
Mm-hmm. So I guess to get back on topic, once we finish our hot takes, hashtag portion of our external testing, it then goes into actual gameplay testing. So we give all of our testers, 6 weeks, 2 months with characters to kind of do their stuff.
I mean, we do multiple cycles, right? So
yeah, that's true. So yeah, it's even longer than that. And they play a whole bunch of games, a million games. I'm always impressed with how many games the groups get in. It's fantastic. And then we iterate, right? Every day. And sometimes we have rules updates every 2 days, every week, every 3 weeks. Like we go through, 50 versions of a character. And maybe it's just changing a strength on an attack. Maybe it's reworking an entire thing. Maybe it's changing a whole concept. Like that's happened before. Yep. We're going to talk about Green Goblin at the end of this. And that was definitely a guy that went through
Yeah, there was a question on a chat that was talking about, or that asked, what was a thing that you didn't think was going to work that eventually worked? Um, Green Goblin was one where it didn't work. We tossed it out and we started over, and then we wound up in a really good place. We'll talk more about how that process worked. But
Yeah,
can you think of something recently that you were just convinced was not going to work, and then it wound up being okay?
that's also released and spoiled.
Let's go with yes. That's probably smart.
Before Josh like starts banging on the glass. Um, hmm. I mean, I don't know if we've really gotten too crazy with what's released right now.
I'm trying to think too. There, there have been a couple of things, but I don't think any of them have been released yet. Um, the only thing that I can really think of is controlling people, and that one we know doesn't work.
I mean, there are ways to
But you made rules that function, but as you pointed out, it doesn't
yeah.
really work because it's not fun and it's not enjoyable.
Um, yeah, I mean, I guess kind of infinity gems, right? Because we started off with the like everyone can take them, and then I mean, I know you remember the first game with
Well,
and all the
actually, I can pick something that we know that doesn't work, which is Thanos being able to take more than 2 Infinity Gems in a basic game.
yeah, yeah.
Because
We did
that I remember.
where
I
Thanos,
remember it very, very well.
and that was super complex. I mean, we can talk about that a tiny bit if we want. Like we did play test Thanos with all 6 gems at the same time. We had it mathed out so that it would make him 17 points,
hmm
and it was not really fun for your opponent.
No, it
uh,
never was. And every time and I think this is kind of neat too, because every time we stepped it back, it became more balanced, but it became less fun. It became less thematic, to the point that where when we were finally playing games and Thanos just wasn't blowing it out, it was like, is this really Thanos with all 6 gems? It wasn't.
yeah,
And that's when we're like, we should just save this for the ultimate encounter because we don't want to distill that.
yeah.
And then the compromise came to give him 2. But yeah, that first game was really fun for you. I think you went first, you teleported like 4 times, wound up in my deployment zone, dazed 4 of my 5 characters.
In the first round, yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
I took
So,
my 1 activation. Your time gem at that point lets you take like 3 activations worth of tokens. It was
yeah.
nonsense. And I was just like, well, I think we can be done.
I mean, it was also kind of the precursor to the ultimate encounter rules, though. So like
It was.
that was very interesting, I guess. It's like that kind of testing, whereas it was a mechanic that didn't end up making it into the final game, right? It kind of like snuck its way into the ultimate encounter stuff because that's where like the 3
Mhm.
cosmic thread activations come from and that kind of thing. So
Yeah, it was all very informative. It was just,
Just not-
it's not 17 points. It's more like 40 points worth of threat. So it's fine.
yes,
But that's one that I can think of that it just didn't work, and it was for multiple reasons. But at the end, it became a flavor thing. The character was not living up to the expectations that a player would have walking into a game with Thanos with a full Infinity Gauntlet.
So we have a question in chat that I'm going to call out at the moment, and we can talk about it at the end because I think it's really good. And it's how do we differentiate designing and developing the ultimate encounters from the standard style of play? So let's talk about that one at the end. I think that'll be a good one.
Cool.
So after months and months and months of playtest cycles, we then lock the characters. And what that means is like the text goes to editing, and I kind of do my final review passes and get it ready for production, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of marks the end of playtest for a character, which doesn't mean that we stop playing with that character, right? Because what's really important in playtest is you don't only ever test new things against new things, because then you're just setting an arbitrary bar, right? Because if everything in the new wave is really good, everything in the new wave will be really good. If everything in the new wave is very low power level, you're going to have a low power wave. So you have to make sure that you're testing new stuff against old stuff and old stuff against new stuff and mixing new stuff with old stuff, especially as the affiliations get larger, right? And we start adding more and more characters to these things. It's important that these new characters can function with the original affiliation and the original affiliation characters, and they don't just whole hog replace people, right? Because that's something that we never ever really want to do, is make it feel like you can't play with your favorite character because XYZ is just a strictly better version. And that is especially true inside of affiliations, right?
Yeah.
So like we can talk about that for a second if we want, but
sure.
Affiliations are very important in the design and creation of characters, because as we go forward and as the roster, not roster game term, but roster of like what's in the game as an option for players to use goes forward, right? Like we can't always make every character 100% unique, right? One, that would be an incredibly huge amount of complexity. And then two, like when we get 500 characters deep, somebody else is going to have a rifle like Winter Soldier, right? Like it's going to happen. So making characters that feel unique and bring something unique to their affiliation is a way to differentiate one character from another. That like you may have two very similar characters, but one's Avengers affiliated and one's Cabal affiliated. So the Cabal is more likely to take their affiliated one rather than the Avengers one, because then they can get their affiliation bonus and they can be affected by the tactic cards and stuff, right? Yep. So that's I think one of the more important things as the game expands that we lean into is affiliations of characters are great. Chat says 452 more characters confirmed. I don't know if there are currently 48 or not, but I'm excited for it.
Confirmed? No, definitely not confirmed.
That's what they said. It's in the chat, Shick. Chat would never lie to us.
Well, I mean, that number might not be wrong depending on confirmed. If you confirm that everything in the Marvel Universe is fair game, it's probably more
than 452 from my experience. So yeah, that's kind of how the initial testing, external testing, getting all the way through that cycle goes, and then into lock, which is preparation for production.
So once we hit lock, as all of this process is going on, the sculpting team and the art team in the studio are working on creating the miniatures and the cards themselves. So that involves that concept document that I talked at the front, and all of this is kind of in parallel. So as development is happening, sculpting is also happening. This allows us a bit of flexibility in terms of, in the rare instance where a rule doesn't line up with a sculpt, for example, to use Punisher again, at one point he had like a submachine gun blaster thing, but the sculpt itself didn't have it. And the argument was, well, maybe it's in the duffel bag because it's probably full of weapons. But what we decided on doing instead is we were like, okay, well, we'll just kind of reiterate rules and make it so that what's on him works for the rules themselves, and then there's no extrapolation. And those are kind of arbitrary choices at times because, of course, these characters, as they're represented in miniature, are abstractions to some extent. But these are things that we look at. We're also looking very closely at how does the miniature fit its base? Did we pick the right base size? There was a moment where Pagani was going to quit because the Killmonger sculpt came in and he had this sweet panther. And Dallas and I were like, well, we're keeping that. And Pagani was like, we've already locked him on a 35 and now you're telling me he might be on a 50? And I was like, it'll be fine. It'll be fine because he's cool.
I don't know if I was going to quit, but I was annoyed.
You were pretty mad. But it's okay. We were all passionate. And he fit on a 35, so it didn't matter. Like, problem solved. It wasn't even a problem. But so these things happen, you know, and there are times where a sculptor comes back with something that we're just like, oh my gosh, it's amazing. We'll just up the base size. As we've gotten more experience and we started to learn kind of like where our direction is going on the miniatures, we're doing pretty good about picking bases compared to where we were. So I don't really think we've had that problem in quite some time, but it can happen. So this parallel development allows all this stuff to happen. It also means that we get to play test at times with prints, so we can kind of see how the character is physically taking up the space, even if it's just a bulk out or not a final version. And that's really helpful too, just to kind of get the scope of what's going on in my view, because we are playing miniatures games for a reason. Like Pagani pointed out, they're not fishing weights. So we want to see that presence. We want to get that feeling.
And I think that's really important, right? I think playing, and this is probably getting pretty deep into philosophy here, which is, I guess, relevant to this discussion.
That's what we're here for.
But I think play testing with either little paper cutouts that look like the character or 3D prints of the character in the miniature and how it's going to look in the end game is very important, right? Because if we have, like, if Killmonger was, I don't know, like crossing his spear and his sword in like a blocking pose, like we've made the very wrong rules for that Killmonger, right? So like tying the rules to the miniature, to the aggression, to him calling people out, like all of that I think is really important in getting a very cohesive look and feel to the character inside of the game. So I think that is a great sort of tangent, I guess. Like when you're play testing a character, does it feel like the character? Does it look like this version of the character? That kind of stuff. And even more so than just like, does he have the right weapons, right? Like I think that's really important.
Yeah, 100%. You don't want you don't want the miniature to be the antithesis of what's being played. You want to be able to look at the character. We always talk about capturing the essence of the character in sculpt, in art, and in rules. When you look at any one of those elements, you should immediately understand what that character largely wants to do. In the case of Killmonger, you see somebody who is calling out his next opponent. He's just laid low somebody else. You feel that aggression. You know that he's offensive, that he's going to take the fight to somebody. As opposed to like a Okoye, where everything about that character is about the bodyguard role of the Dora Milaje and the fact that she's standing there defiant and she's just saying, come at me, like bring it on, because I know I can handle you and I will protect my king or my ward or whoever she happens to be in defense of. And so this is all part of that panel to play experience, because again, we're talking about taking a character from the comic book cage and accurately and truthfully representing it as best we can in a final game form. And this, of course, goes to art too. So we do a lot of art. We work with artists. Check out the art panel that Dallas and Josh did. It was really great and informative. There's no way I can cover even a percentage of what they did yesterday. But this kind of brings us up to the point to where now we have everything and we have our rules. We have all of the stuff and we're ready to move forward to do a last kind of check and send that character out to be created and to hit store shelves and then to watch as people and players get their hands on it, see the rules, and get to experience it on the tabletop themselves, and hopefully see that we did it right.
I like to call that hot takes phase 2.
Ideally, hot takes phase number 1 has prepared you for hot takes phase number 2, but there are a lot more voices, so it's always interesting. And of course, the way that you guys in the wild kind of see stuff is in slow kind of Josh teases, right? We like to build anticipation. It's one of the most fun things of anything that you're excited about is that slow reveal. Whether you admit it or not, you know you love it. And Josh loves doing it. So you get a very different hot take kind of progression than the playtesters who get to see everything at once.
Yeah.
Which is also kind of fun. Because then, of course, you get to watch how that discussion changes a month or two post-release.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we kind of get to go through the whole playtest process again with the public, right? Like you get the hot takes phase, assessment phase, and you get this is where it shook out.
And I think, in complete honesty, once that character is out there, it's not like the testing is stopped. That character is not going to change unless it does something that we completely missed and we failed utterly on in terms of the game. Like if it blue screens the game, it has to change. But otherwise, that character is that character. But that doesn't mean that we can't take lessons, just like Dallas talked about with sculpting, or we talk about with anything, right? The hobby, even the making of hobby, is about learning and progression. You always get better the more you do something. The more you see, the more you learn. So we're always learning as well. And some of those lessons do come back into things that are far in the future. Some of the things are lessons that we already learned, but we realized them by the time that we were already done with the project because of how far ahead we're working. So we're like, well, yeah, we learned that lesson. You'll see it you'll see it get fixed. But it's being willing to take that critique, just like in testing, and apply it to make the game even better than it currently is. And that's always the goal. Well, I think I lost my friend Pagani. Josh!
I think I'm back, maybe.
Oh, you're back.
Ah, we did
Perfect. We did it.
Fantastic. So I got dropped about when you were talking about getting better at the process.
Yeah, well, that's kind of it. I was just really wordy on it. I knew you were gone, so I decided to fill time to give Josh time. That's what I was doing. It was me being benevolent.
Yeah, and I think you're going to see that reflected in the rules, right? Whenever you're creating a new game, you're learning a lot about a whole ton of different systems and mechanics, right? Mm-hmm. So as we go forward, we're going to learn how to make rules more clear, how to explain things better, and what our intent are for those rules, right? And we've had a couple questions that have come up that we've had to put in the FAQ, and that's great because that lets us know about how you all interpret rules and how we can write them to be better for you. So when you ask these questions, when you bring up these things, like all of that to me is a learning experience and a bonus purely. Like, and we will just constantly get better and better and better at this. So.
Yeah, and so let's segue a little bit because every stream has been able to show off something fun. So why can't we? Why can't we, Pagani? Let's show something off. So one of the really interesting things in panel to play in taking these characters is that once in a while things break the mold and rules and graphic design and art and everything have to come together to figure out how to adjust, how to make something that you and I have worked on and then play tested and everything, and now we bring it to them and we're like, well, this is how it has to work. So let's talk about transform. Let's dive in. I've got a Wasp card here that I smuggled in, and Josh is behind his bulletproof glass. So let's show people what they're in for when it comes to a transforming character. Well, I'll fix it a little bit.
So I think you just mentioned like physical components, right? And I think transform is a pretty big divergence from the normal physical components, right? Because in theory, this card will pop up at some point, and I have no idea if it has because I can't see it. But
it did.
Yeah,
it's there. Trust me.
It's got a new layout, right? It's a horizontal card instead of a vertical card. And this was a big challenge because we had to figure out how to make essentially two characters, right? The normal size and the tiny size on one card because of the injured mechanic, right? We couldn't give you two stack cards because you have to flip over the card to be injured. So Wasp and Ant-Man both have this horizontal card. And this was a really interesting sort of squish together of graphic design and game development, right? Because we had to find a way to give you defense stats. We had to find a way to give you health and stamina and all these things on the physical card. And that dictated that we couldn't change them between forms, right? Because when you go from, like if you only have one card, we could put the whole stat block on there twice, but that takes up so much room, right? And there's this huge physical space concern on our cards because I'm a wordy guy when it comes to rules. I try and spell everything out as best I can and make it as clear as possible.
And if you want to hear all of that, you can watch the design philosophy panel from yesterday where we talked about why that's a conscious choice we make and why we think it is beneficial overall to the entire game experience to be wordy.
And that issue is compounded on these transform characters, right? Because there's two of them on the card. So that will certainly sort of portray what we can and can't do on transform characters is how much physical space we have to work with on the card.
But the cool thing is that if you imagine the idea that, yes, each side of the character, each form of the character, the normal and in this case the tiny, although I would note that normal is the only consistent in the core rules themselves that will be added with these characters. You do kind of get, 1.5 characters worth of abilities typically because of that transform mechanic. So each side is doing a little less, but overall you're getting to do way more.
Yeah, which is really cool. And you get the transform rules, right?
Yep. You want to just spoil what happens when somebody transforms? Josh can't stop you.
No, we've already shown it fully.
Oh, we did already show it, didn't we?
Yeah.
The place
So
one.
when
That was
you
a
get
long
to
time
transform,
ago.
you get to
Man.
place within range 1, right? Which
Yeah.
the first time you play with Ant-Man and Wasp, and we're not going to show Ant-Man today, so calm down, chat. But the first time you play with them, you're going to be like, oh, these characters are everywhere. Like, because, I mean, they can transform multiple times per activation, right? They can transform in reaction to other things. So there's just so much movement, and they're so hard to pin down. I think it really, really, really nails like what these characters specifically should feel like. And then, of course, transform will be used in the future for more exciting stuff. So,
yes,
yeah,
it's definitely not. It's definitely not just here. It's laying the groundwork for something. We're gonna get there. His name is Sentry.
Oh, Shick doing it again.
I know. I'm just gonna keep bringing it up, and then someday we're gonna actually do it. So I'm gonna back myself into a corner.
Someday.
But that's my goal. That's my goal. It's always been my goal since day one. But yeah, I think one of the really cool things about how the transform rules worked, especially, and then we leaned into with these characters, like you said, was the mobility. So it was making sure that they had ways to transform in multiple times in an activation, but that they couldn't abuse it. And it was a fine kind of balance in learning, okay, how many times can you use the superpower? And then we want them to transform back. We'll put it on top of the attacks. And you'll also notice that part of the design that was originally there for those characters is that some of their attacks are above the bar when it comes to their cost versus their strength versus their range and all this stuff. But they force the character to transform. And that's a really fun way to play with that cycle too, to make sure that players don't just go, well, this is the best the best version. I'll stick with that the whole game. Because you're going to paint 2 miniatures. You're going to have both versions of the character, and we wanted those to be relevant. So we wanted to see those characters swapping a lot on the table. And there's a little bit of a push on the characters in terms of the rules and how those work, but there's benefits for that too. And then visually you get to be like, yeah, and then they transform and you see little Ant-Man, big Ant-Man, little Ant-Man, and he's going all over the place, or Wasp in the same method.
Yeah, so I guess that's kind of a spoiler, right? Is that Ant-Man, much like Wasp, can transform back and forth multiple times per round and things like that. There are a bunch of rules questions happening in chat. We're not going to answer those right now. If you want to ask rules questions about it, feel free to tag the Atomic Mass Games Facebook page in the Facebook group, or message the Facebook page directly, and I will get to them when I can. Yeah, where are we at now? Now that our sweet.
Where are we at now? Do you want to talk a little bit about the process with Green Goblin, since we've kind of mentioned how he was one of our problem children?
So we knew going into Green Goblin that we really wanted to do something about how his personality changes drastically depending on what's happening around him as a character, right?
So the big thing for me from the design point where we started was, Norman Osborn is mentally unstable. He has the genius and the sinister intellect of the Green Goblin in Norman Osborn, but then he also has this inner psychosis that's just rage, and it's aggression, and it's kind of animalistic. And if you read a lot of Spider-Man comics, or you know the storylines, even have seen some of the movies, right? That is always expressed. Like Norman Osborn as the Green Goblin could easily overcome Peter Parker, but his mental instability, his hubris, his ability to control the insanity from the Goblin Serum is always kind of his Achilles heel. Like right when he's on top, Peter Parker can always take advantage of that and win. And so we talked originally about okay, well, we want to do this with this character. And the first place we started was, well, what if these personality traits were cards that overlaid on top of the standard card, and you could kind of choose and manipulate them, but then you were also forced into different options?
And that's a really cool design, right? Like having a character where we give you a card that overlaps all of his current attacks and gives you an entirely changed suite of attacks. Like that's really interesting and really unique and awesome. but it gets very, very complicated, right? One, it's very difficult for players that are not familiar with the character to either play as or against the character because the stats are constantly changing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't like where we ended up, which was the injured side is sort of the crazy side, and then the healthy side is the more calm and collected side.
Mm-hmm.
This is like, which card does Green Goblin have for his defensive stats right now, right? So like now I have to be checking with my opponent. Now my opponent has to be keeping track of everything that's happening for Green Goblin. And that just adds a massive layer of complexity onto Green Goblin, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because each there's a concept in game development and game design that is cognitive load. It's psychology, actually, I guess. But it's a person can only keep so many variables in their brain at the same time, essentially, is the concept. And Crisis Protocol has a lot going on. There's power, there's damage, there's crisis, there's movement, there's superpowers, there's reactive powers, there's reactive cards, there's tactic cards in general. Like, there's so many different moving parts. Did we want to add another really cool but really complex mechanic to the game?
And then on top of that, there's the physical, like there's the manipulative ability too, right? Because we knew that by the time we were talking about the design, that tokens went on the character card, the damage was going to be stacked on the character card. So now you're talking about, where are those tokens? I have to move this card. How big is that card? What is it covering up? It became a thing that was very quickly, just from the concept phase, like not going to work.
Yeah.
And so we actually shelved Goblin for a while because we just wound up at a point where he got shifted down in the schedule a little bit, and we were like, this isn't going to work. We'll move on to some other things.
Yeah. And it kind of always stayed in the back of our minds, right? Because I feel like every once in a while we just kind of pop our head and be like, what about this? Nah, not that either. And then like we would walk away again, right? Mm-hmm. And where we ended up with Goblin, I think, is a very unique character, of course. He has by far the most changes from healthy to injured. And I think it was sort of a great compromise of getting the two feelings of Green Goblin down while not overloading players, right?
Yeah.
It's very, very important.
Yeah, kind of the genesis of that was that I was reading the 2016 Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man, the Return of the Amazing Spider-Man. And then we got to the Red Goblin arc. And there's some great moments in there where, if you haven't read the arc, you should. It's really fun. The Carnage symbiote and Green Goblin basically glom together and they create the Red Goblin. And the Red Goblin is unstoppable. Like, Parker just can't do anything about it. The whole Spider team can't do anything about it. But Parker eventually wins by baiting out the Norman psychoses after he's kind of beaten him up, and then everything goes. And I was like, well, what if we just created two different very distinct play styles where they switch when Goblin's on the back foot? Because oftentimes that psychosis really manifests when things are not going Goblin's way, and instead of retreating and being more tactical, he becomes far less, and he just kind of goes, okay, well, I'll just kill Parker.
He's very reckless.
Yeah, and so that was interesting in that it allowed me the space to kind of create two very different versions of the characters that were very, what I felt, indicative of the character. But also another design goal we had for the Goblin that we had talked about initially was that we wanted him to be slightly above his weight class because he had drawbacks.
Yeah.
And that was still really important to me, in that you could see that this character is more than his threat value, but because what he does also has disadvantages to the player, he's not as good, right? And
I think Nebula's the same way, right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And so that's kind of where that idea of, like, he gets to do very different things on both sides, which are indicative of where he is as a character. But the side in which he kind of ramps up and becomes super crazy has very significant drawbacks, because you're losing things that are manipulative and board control, and you're gaining a lot of offense, but then you also lose any strategic ability to win the mission. And as we've talked about, at the core of Crisis Protocol, it's about the mission. And to me, that narratively fits so well with Norman Osborn and his role as the Green Goblin in all these stories.
Absolutely.
Where he's winning, he suffers a setbacks, and he's just like, screw it. I'm I'm just going to murder you with pumpkin bombs.
And my glider.
And his glider.
So we do have kind of a throwback question here from Gribble in chat, which is asking about the design philosophy between the two sides of a transforming character, and because they both have the change size ability, why didn't we make that like a shared ability? And the answer is a couple fold here. One, we didn't really have a way to have an ability kind of split between both sides, so we just kind of had to put it on both. We maybe could have had a way to graphically design-wise put it into the middle of the card instead of on the left or the right. We explored a couple things with that. Didn't really work out too well. And then two, we kind of always want to have the full text on everything, right? Because we could have had it on one side and then just put the name and the cost on the other side, but we want to have the full text under every rule if we can. Was sort of what was going on there. So it's more of, I guess, a graphic design issue than a game design issue in that case. Yeah.
And then to kind of just wrap up the Green Goblin discussion and to tie back to our hot takes thing, I think one of the things that was really nice is that we did Goblin that way. And when you turn that over to the external testers and you get those hot takes, that was one where it was like I was really watching for what would people think about this iteration of Green Goblin, of Norman Osborn. And because it's interesting because they don't know what came before. They don't know what could have been. They only know what's there. And then, of course, as testers, they know what they might be able to do, like with changes in iteration. But when they saw that version of the character and they were like, oh, this is really awesome. It feels like Norman Osborn. I was like, okay, the fact that we didn't do the crazy, like over-cognitive load was the right choice, right? Sometimes the best creative stuff you'll ever do is when you actually impose rails. When you say, we're not going to just do whatever the sky's the limit. We're going to figure out how to work within a structure that we know that works.
Yep. You got to play in your sandbox. You got to know how big it is.
And sometimes you got to realize when you need more sand.
Yep.
But that's a long discussion that's not taken lightly.
That is true. Yeah, I mean, I think I guess to talk about more sand possibilities, right? Like Transform, that's a more sand or bigger sandbox. Infinity Gems, same idea, like adding these new core things to the game. And that is not something that is done unless is absolutely required to really nail something. So, yeah.
So you were taking questions as we were going. You're making a list. Let's answer those because we're almost at our time. So
I don't have too many of them over here. So the first one is from Gribble again. How do you design Ultimate Encounters, or how does the design of Ultimate Encounters differ from standard characters and stuff? And I think this is a really interesting one because we do kind of have like a completely different direction that we take with Ultimate Encounters, which usually we will sort of go through the comics, find a storyline that we like, find a specific event or something like that. And then we won't like copy that event necessarily, but we will use it to inform how, like the Thanos Ultimate Encounter, right? Obviously isn't specifically an encounter from the comics, right? But like, how many times have people fought against Thanos with the gauntlet and then had some little tiny glimmer of hope of beating him and then bringing that into how they do it, right? So we kind of took that concept of fighting Thanos with the gauntlet. How do you do that? Oh, well, you get into his hubris, right? You get into his arrogance, and then you execute your 1% chance plan, or 1 in 14 million, or whatever it was in Endgame, right? And that's sort of how we came across that. And it was like, cool, well, what's our 1%, right? How are we going to narratively tell the story? And then it's very backwards, I guess, from how it currently goes, because when I'm making an Ultimate Encounter, I'll usually design the encounter first, and then the Cosmic Threat character will come second.
Yeah.
So
yeah, knowing what the goals are and then making the character fit. And Ultimate Encounters are also fun because typically what happens is we have a big meeting and everyone kind of talks about, okay, what are some of the iconic things? Like if you were thinking of this boss encounter, this Ultimate Encounter, what would you think the Crisis teams are trying to do? Like, what are we trying to do? And I think that's important because you hit it on the head. The idea is not that the Ultimate Encounters, or really any of the missions or crises in Crisis Protocol, are one-to-one to a direct storyline. But what we want to do is draw from that inspiration and create an experience that is kind of a foundational framework. Yeah, framework. That's a new word. That
trademark.
Then allows the players to create their own story that feels like it could be directly from the comics, right? It's not historical. It's not the historical approach of these are exactly what we're here. This is exactly how it played out. Now reenact. It is inspired by. You are creating a new story that is evocative and beholden to what came before. And that's the big goal, right? Yeah. Because we want you to be able to take these tools as the player and make your own story.
And I think it's also important to talk about like the game balance work that goes into Ultimate Encounters is very different than the standard play game balance work, right? What's really important in the Ultimate Encounters is that they feel exciting, right? It's not necessarily that an even chance to win or the team to win. It's that when you play them, you get that excitement, you get that feeling. And for anyone who's played Ultimate Encounter, like it's really scary to play as the Crisis team against Thanos because this guy's got the Infinity Gauntlet. He's got all these crazy gems, right? Like he has so much cool stuff that he can do, and you have to try and find out a way to beat it. And you are sort of fighting from your back foot. And I think getting that narrative feel to that is more important than having a 50-50 win rate between the two teams.
Yeah,
I think that's true in all encounters, right? That's true for Ultron, that's true for Hulk, that's true for Thanos, that's true for...
I mean, I totally agree. I think the way that which we are approaching the Ultimate Encounters is very much the idea that these are flexible. You know, again, we're making these so that they are largely balanced and players can compete against each other in a more direct way. But we address that in the rules and we say, if you're going to try to min-max your Crisis teams, play at a higher difficulty level, because now you're taking advantage of the system and you should be challenged accordingly. But for the people who just want to dive in and tell that story, to experience that narrative, to create their own kind of experience, that's also very much like a lot of the board game experiences out there that have a single player kind of doing a pseudo GM. It's almost like a light RPG experience in a way, because you can take those and you can tell a story. You can reenact your own tale from the Marvel Universe and live this iconic thing. And that's why it's a different game mode, and we call them different game modes. And that's the goal of each game mode, is not to take the single standard 1v1 experience and add more players to it. It's to take the core of Marvel Crisis Protocol and create a new game out of it.
Yep. Yeah. I don't have any other questions. Copy pasted, so I guess.
There we go. All right.
No.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Pagani. It's a pleasure as always. We'll have to do this more often now that we have the technology. Josh just started crying over there because he's the one actually making it all work.
We should stop cutting onions.
It's true. But otherwise, thank you, chat, for joining us. I hope you guys are having a blast at Virtual Gen Con. Be sure to check back with us at 3 p.m. Pacific, as Dallas and I will be sitting down to paint some very special miniatures and discuss X-Mans and mutants and everything going on with Gen Con as well. I'm just going to say, I don't know if Josh is okay with it, but Dallas and I are both going to be painting Wolverine on stream. So if you're interested to see how that miniature looks, to see our own takes on Wolverine, and to just hang out for a couple hours on an extended Atomic Mass Transmissions Live, I'm sure Pagani will be in the chat as well as he usually is. So we're going to be talking just in general. No spoilers on that stream as far as I'm aware, unless somebody does something crazy. Josh, I'm looking at you. You never know what's going to happen. It is Virtual Gen Con. So thanks for joining us, guys. Have a wonderful couple of hours. We'll see you back here at 3 p.m. Pacific for our big Hobby Atomic Mass Transmissions Live Wolverine edition.
Huzzah! Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.